All right. Well, welcome to Healthy Chats with the Doc. Today, we're going to talk about genetics and specifically the COMT gene, the wired tired gene. So, Doc, a lot of times everyone started out with the MTHFR gene, and now what we're learning is it's not just the gene, it's the interplay between the genes. But let's talk a little bit about the COMT gene and how it affects the neurotransmitters.
Yes. So the COMT gene, or COMT, is another enzyme. So this is another assembly line, another machine on an assembly line in that big factory we talk about all the time, right? This particular enzyme is responsible for several things in the human body. One is that it metabolizes our neurotransmitters. So the COMT gene breaks down what are called catecholamines, which are our excitatory neurotransmitters. So the COMT is catecholamine methyltransferase. So it breaks down dopamine into norepinephrine, which breaks down into epinephrine, which is obviously important because we need to, we need to be excited, but then we need to calm down, right? So the COMT, one of its primary functions is to process those neurotransmitters in a healthy way, which results in a healthy balance of those energy levels that affect mood and focus and energy, etc., throughout the day. COMT is also part of what we call phase 2 detoxification. So in the liver, it's also responsible for clearing out toxins, and our liver has a 2-phase process in clearing out toxins. It has a phase 1 and a phase 2. And that second phase is really important because between phase 1 and phase 2, those toxins become super toxic. So phase 2 better be working so we can get those super toxins neutralized and excreted. So that's the other role of COMT, is part of detoxification. It has some other functions, but those are kind of the big ones that we talk about.
That's interesting. So what I found so fascinating about genetics is, every gene has a core function, and then there's the interplay between the various genes and that type of thing. And so when you talk about, the flow of and how the COMT gene affects the neurotransmitters, how does that relate? Because there's been some studies that show people that have issues with addiction many times have a mutation in the COMT gene. Why would that be?
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat that a little bit for my audience because it got broken up there a little bit. But basically, the COMT gene breaks down the neurotransmitters, excitatory ones like dopamine and norepinephrine. And we see that there is a relationship with COMT mutations in people who have addiction disorders. So why does that happen? So so there is lots of research that's correlated with this particular gene SNP and increased rates. There's a 2-fold increase rate in rats and in humans in gambling and drinking and opiates and any of these addictive patterns. One of the theories is the dopamine hypothesis, where the patient has let me back up a step. So again, COMT breaks down dopamine. If you have a genetic variant, that gene is made wrong. So when the blueprint goes to make that machine in the factory, that machine doesn't work very well. So we can't convert product A to product B. In this example, that would be dopamine into norepinephrine. So we can't break down dopamine. That means you're going to run into higher dopamine levels. So if you have a COMT mutation, you run higher on dopamine levels. So individuals with this mutation, they have a higher baseline. Now, when those of us who don't have that mutation, we have a lower baseline, and we get a rush from going on a roller coaster or, doing sporting events or, something like that. And we get these spikes in dopamine. And it's like, oh, that was fun, Now, people who have the mutation have a higher baseline. So for them, this is normal, and they have lower spikes. So it's harder for them to get that rush that most of us get with simple activities. Therefore, they are more susceptible to something bigger that's going to give them that rush. And so they end up becoming more addicted as a result. They're much more prone to impulse control issues and addictive tendencies because of that dopamine hypothesis. So
Could
basically,
that
if
be
you
a
aren't breaking
reason?
down your
Like,
dopamine,
I wonder if they've
you
ever
get
done
set up in a
anything
different
with
situation.
extreme sports people, like how
Oh, I lost your volume. Say that again.
the extreme sports, people who chase the extreme sports, they're just looking for that adrenaline high and that kind of a thing.
Right, exactly.
So, doctor, like one of the things that I was fascinated with is like the methyl sensitive, the methyl craver, and a lot of it has to do with the COMT gene and how it interplays with the MTHFR gene.
Yes.
So how does that work? Because that really does determine what B vitamin, for example, is the B vitamin you should take.
Right. So this is, oh, I just lost you guys, but I got the volume on the computer, so I know that they can heard that. But how does the COMT and the MTHFR interplay? And I will try and be as concise on that as possible because that's a little bit more complex. So we've talked about the need for people who have difficulty making methyl groups. If you have an MTHFR deficit, you don't make methyl groups very well. And that can lead to a variety of different issues. One of the things that methyl groups does is makes dopamine. Methyl makes our neurotransmitters. So if somebody doesn't make methyl groups very well, they commonly will have some fatigue and some depression. And a lot of that is related to low production of those neurotransmitters like dopamine. Now, somebody who has a COMT mutation can't break down dopamine. So they're more up here all the time because they have plenty of neurotransmitters. So what happens if a patient has both mutations? They have an MTHFR that doesn't make methyl groups, which means they don't make good neurotransmitters, but they also have a COMT that doesn't metabolize the neurotransmitters very well. So if we start giving them methyl groups to support them, you may end up flooding the pipeline that doesn't have an exit, right? So, think about a clogged toilet, or that's a terrible, how about the clogged sink? That's probably a better analogy, right? You can't put a bunch of stuff in the sink if there's no way for it to get out the bottom. And that's kind of what's happening if you give somebody too many methyl groups when they have a COMT mutation. And that can, so that's where we have people who we call are methyl sensitive. If you give them methyl groups, they're methyl sensitive because they can't handle the influx of those methyl groups. They can't handle the increased production of those neurotransmitters because they can't break them down. The trick when somebody has a need for methyl groups because they have an MTHFR mutation, but they also have a COMT mutation, and so they can't handle a lot of methyl groups, is about finding the balance. And that's a trial and error. It's challenging. You have to first start off with definitely no methyl groups and try and clear the pipe. You got to try and see if that pipe can clear out a little bit better than it was before. And then you can slowly give them some methyl, like maybe try once a week, right? Maybe twice a week and see if that works a little bit, see how that works. And it's sometimes you give them a little too much and we have a problem. And then we got to go scale it back and clear the pipe again and start over. So
does that relate to why, you can make somebody more anxious, and would that relate to why the stress management and the cortisol with people who have COMT mutations, did that all kind of fit together?
Yeah, so people with a COMT, they're higher on their catecholamine production, so they are, they're ramped up all the time, and their cortisol is going to go along with that as well too, because they're just going. They can't calm down, so they tend to run higher on cortisol as well too. And then they're more prone to anxiety, focus issues, sleep issues, because their on switch is just always on because they can't dump it out. The pipe is clogged, like the COMT machine in the factory doesn't work, so we're getting backup in the factory. So those people tend to have more adrenal stress because they tend to run higher on all those adrenal hormones as a result. And over time, then what can happen is the body can only keep up with that level of production for so long. And they eventually will crash and they'll get a drop in their neurotransmitters and their cortisol levels, and they'll be in, an adrenal fatigue state, or, hypothalamic dysfunction state. And those people then, so we'll see, so kind of going back to what we talked about in the beginning, that wired but tired, right? So that means two different things. One is when somebody is in early COMT, or in their younger years, and COMT isn't working, and they're running on high catecholamines and their cortisol's up and all these things, they're wired. They're like, blah, they're going all the time, but they're tired because they can't sleep. And so they keep going, but internally they just need to take a rest because, the body needs to rest, but they have trouble with that because they've got these signals telling them to keep going all the time. And then later, as people become more depleted because the body can't keep up with that production for an extended period of time. And at what point that happens can vary. I see some people as early as their mid to late 30s start to have depletion in those levels, but often it's usually not till like 40s or 50s when we start to see a depletion in those levels. And those patients are now even more wired and tired. They're exhausted because they don't have, any catecholamines left, but they're still a little bit in the on position. So, any little bit of catecholamine stimulation is still making them feel super, ramped up, so to speak. So, that's can be challenging for those individuals, and it can be hard for us to kind of manage them over time. But that goes back to that wired and tired piece of the picture, and why you're going to see increased anxiety and difficulty sleeping and difficulty focusing, because you're going to have high catecholamines, which relates to the neuroadrenal function, which means that cortisol usually goes along with that and is also elevated during those times too.
Well, just another good reason why someone can't look at just one gene mutation.
Yes.
Yeah. You gotta look at the whole person.
You
right?
do. And this is and this was, when I was first learning about genetics years ago, everybody's like, oh, MTHFR. And, you do a blood test and someone had a single, there's two MTHRs that we look at, and someone would have a single heterozygous, and we're like, oh, you need all this methyl group, right? Well, we were all over methylating people and we just didn't know. And it wasn't until, years later that when you see all the machines in the factory, how they're interplaying with each other and how important that is to understand, because you can't just give somebody a bunch of methyl groups, if they have a COMT, and if you don't know, then you don't know, and you could be creating it worse. Now, we do know there's certain archetypes, and I have patients who I might not have their genetic results, but, I had like my patient earlier this morning. She is go, go, go. She is on it. She's super organized. Like, she doesn't need a lot of sleep. Like, she does a lot of, she snowboards and she skis, and, she's, but very active all the time, but she's very wired and tired, and she has difficulty with sleep, and she feels exhausted, but she can't stop, and I'm like, okay, I don't have your genetics, but I'm pretty sure you have a COMT. So I'm going to be real careful about giving you any methyl groups. So
right.
We do see that
it's
pattern.
Interesting, right? How when we started 6 years ago, and how much we've learned, and how much, the knowledge we've gained from genetics is so important.
Yeah. There's so much and I think it's really important, there's a lot of, like, I work with a lot of new practitioners, and, a lot of people are still doing let's just touch your MTHFR. But, that can result in problems. You really have to see the whole picture, because if you're dumping a bunch of fluid down that pipe and there's a clog, you're going to have a much bigger problem, right? So that can be challenging.
Yeah, so let's talk a little also too. So that makes sense, the wired and tired, and over methylating, and those types of things. Thanks, that was a good explanation. I always love it when you use the warehouse. So there's also been some articles that talk about the COMT gene relates to how you break down and process phytonutrients. What does that mean?
Right. So in addition, we talked about it breaking down neurotransmitters. It's also part of phase 2 detoxification. So the catecholamine methyltransferase. So this machine breaks down catechols or catecholamines, which is not just our dopamine and norepinephrine, but it's also things like There's nutrients in like green tea, for example. There's catechols in green tea. There's catechols in cilantro and berries and apples. So it can be hard, so there's the challenge is that there's certain nutrients in our diet that also have to be processed via these pathways as well too. And this is a much more subtle thing to focus on and look at with patients that can be harder to identify. And it may or may not be a problem. So I always think about it is that like how small is the pipe and how much are you putting into it? And every little bit you want to reduce, you want to try and minimize how much is going down the pipe. Well, this particular COMT pipe handles neurotransmitters that are increased by methyl groups. It handles environmental toxins because it's part of phase 2 detoxification. It also breaks down hormones and other endogenous toxins in our body as well too. So you look at all of that as the total load on that machine. How much is that machine trying to handle right now? And you want to try and minimize that load so that you don't have backup, right? So that you cannot have quite as much dopamine, that you can have, healthier estrogen metabolism, so you can have better detoxification from the environment. So you want to remove as much of the load as possible. And so I always focus on things like environmental toxins and how else can we clear out your toxins through other pathways and clear out your estrogen through other pathways, managing the methyl groups, and what can I do to increase the size of the pipe? Like, how can I increase the number of pipes? How can I increase the activity of that COMT so it can handle more? So that's usually how I think about and approach it. Some of the things that people talk about though and ask about is like, well, what about these catechols from our diet? Like, are they putting too much pressure on the COMT? Well, they might, but I have a really hard time telling people not to eat a berry because it might block up, right? I want to focus more on don't use plastics. Because we know that BPAs and other toxins, bisphenols and other toxins in our environment slow COMT down. So I usually focus on avoid those bad things, don't not eat the good things, like they may slow it down a little bit, but you're going to have much better results if you focus on these bad things that slow it down, like these environmental toxins. But yeah, green tea, berries, anything that's going to have a catechol containing group in it, which is not very intuitive. Like we all know what a starch and a protein is, but what's a catechol, right? But like capers, parsley, berries, apples, green tea, those are kind of some of the catechols. So it can be hard because it can be challenging for people to think about like, well, how do I know what that is and how do I cut that out of my diet? But if somebody has, if I have a patient who's like, I drink 10 cups of green tea a day and I have berries and apples and, twice a day as my snack, then I might say, okay, because you have a COMT, we might want to change that up a little bit because that's a lot, right? And so, but again, I'm going to focus on those other factors as well too.
But there are we're running out of time again, but just to kind of wrap up now, what can you do? It seems like there are stimulants like caffeine that you should, possibly control, and that stress management and meditation and yoga would be a really nice balance, right? Those are the kinds of lifestyle things too.
Right. So we always talk about, avoiding environmental toxins. Not only because this particular gene processes those environmental toxins and therefore is stressed out and damaged by those environmental toxins, but we talk about this all the time, right? Like we have these environmental toxins everywhere and they cause oxidative stress and damage to genes and affect gene expression. So we want to avoid toxins anyway. But, specifically talking about COMT, we want to make sure that we're doing that. You want to make sure that you're managing what's going into the pipe, minimizing the methyl groups and anything that's going to stimulate those neurotransmitters. You also want to bring more workers to the factory, right? We talked about this before, the cofactors, those workers that are specially trained to help COMT. COMT does really well with magnesium, copper, vitamin C. These nutrients can all help with COMT increasing activity. We also know increasing like testosterone levels of somebody's, females and male who get depleted in testosterone as they age. We know we can increase that and that will boost their COMT. And so those are the things that we focus on like a biological, biochemical basis. And we always know that the healthy stress management and lifestyle will change your genetic expression. And healthy stress management will also help with reducing the number of dopamine and the amount of catecholamines you're producing, because you're stressed, that's all going up. So, working on mindfulness, working on meditation, working on yoga. And we've seen this in the research. I think we talked about this recently. We talk about it a lot. There's so much research that shows that meditation, stress management, yoga, that all has a direct impact on your genetic expression and therefore your overall health. There's a huge, benefit there. And we live in such a crazy, stressful, toxic world. And I see it all the time. My patients, it's stress and inflammation from environmental stress and toxins are the two things that ultimately contribute to people's downfall in health and inability to become healthy again. And, it goes back to the research that we see in this gene expression, specifically around COMT, because these people are more prone to high stress.
Yeah. Well, what a great way to end that on, hey, that's just who you are. If you're born with it, embrace it and do the things that make you feel better and can optimize and help you thrive, right?
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, doctor, until next week,
Yep.
have a good one.
Nice to see you.